Good evening and welcome to a very special live stream here on Novara Media as we analyse the outcomes and implications of last week's local elections results. With me, I couldn't think of anyone better. Michael Walker and Aaron Bastani. How are you both?
You're a very balanced panel this evening. Sky News style.
Ofcom regulation.
They were already beefing before the cameras went live. And maybe we can bring in a little bit of that over the course of tonight. So we're going to be discussing whether reform might be on course to form a government and what are the potential obstacles and banana skins in their way on the road to number 10. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about Labour. Have they shagged it, basically? Are they going to be able to turn the ship around by 2029? Or are challenger parties from both the left and the right going to make sure that they capsize for good? Before we get started, I want to say, like I always do, that I believe that media is only as good as the context that it includes. And that's why so much of establishment political media gets caught flat-footed. So Keir Starmer's surprise tanking in the polls, or reform doing well at the local elections, or even something like Brexit, it always catches these people by surprise because they don't like to look outside of Westminster. And I think that that's important for the story that we're covering tonight. The reason why reform's message can cut through is because most of our political journalism is just low information slop. So if you want something better, something different, please consider giving 1 hour's worth of your wage every month or whatever you can afford by heading to novaramedia.com/support or following the link in our bio. So, Michael, I want to start with you. I was comparing the number of councillors gained by reform to their high watermark for UKIP. So the best UKIP ever did was about 500 councillors. This was in 2016. The most they gained in one go was 2015 with 176 councillors at one local elections. And reform last week got 677. So that takes their total to 805 local councillors. In terms of significance, what do you make of that comparison? Because UKIP, on the back of those electoral gains and then coming second in a lot of constituencies in parliamentary elections, they're able to get an in-out referendum and a hard Brexit, right? Transformed British politics. Where does reform go with this?
I think the difference is in the early 2010s, the Conservatives were worried that reform would split some of their vote and allow Labour in. Now the Conservatives are worried that reform is going to replace them as the mainstream party. I don't think David Cameron was seriously worried that if he didn't do an in-out referendum, UKIP would replace the Conservatives as the major right-wing party. Right? I think that's the difference. You didn't see UKIP come first in local elections. You did see them come first, I think, in a European election, but they were always very much a protest vote specifically about Europe. So I think this is very different. And I don't think we should be surprised that this is different because it's the same story kind of everywhere. Right? So if you look at France, 2017, Le Pen got 33%. I think by 2022, it's in the 40s. The AfD, in the mid-2010s, they were getting 10%. Now they're getting 20%. 20% might still seem low, but that makes them the second largest party in Germany. So sort of the right wing, the populist right, is increasing its vote kind of everywhere across Europe. And it's doing so for a similar reason in all of those places, I think.
What do you reckon?
That's certainly true. I mean, the alchemy of Farage is being able to go from the single issue politician par excellence with Brexit to something much broader. And I think many people justifiably thought he could not do that. This is a man who finished first now. This is a really extraordinary statistic. I don't actually think I've heard anybody say this. He's finished first now in national elections with 3 separate parties. So UKIP and the Brexit Party finished first in 2 separate European elections. And now, of course, Reform finished first in local elections. That is a stunning political achievement. It's like stunning. It blows away anything I can think of. You might talk about Winston Churchill crossing the shit. I mean, this is just extraordinary. So I think few people questioned Farage's personal capability as a politician, but I think to elevate it to a stage where you have a national political program was always the big question. He's cleared the first hurdle, right? It's still a long way away. And we need to remember this. The Green Party still have more councillors than Reform. And lots of people will say, well, Reform just picked up hundreds of councillors and the Greens just picked up 40. The Greens, I think, rightly would say, well, look, we're trying to build a political party for a century, not a media cycle. They could do better. But the question is, with reform, are they building a party apparatus, an organisation, an ideology, which, like you say, can replace the Tories, in which case they would also want to last a century. Those are the kinds of timeframes successful mainstream parties last. He's cleared the first hurdle. And I think, actually, we talk about the by-elections, the local elections, but I think the by-election was really important. Even though they just won by 6 votes, psychologically huge. In 2014, UKIP just failed to win in Hayward and Lancashire. In 2019, Brexit, the Brexit Party failed to win in Peterborough. Both times was about 600 votes short. And that was because of Labour's ability to get at the vote, their data analytics.
Had the Stoke by-election as well. Wasn't that supposed to be Corbyn's Waterloo?
That's right. That wasn't so close. That was a couple of thousand. But that's true. That's another example. And Reform just haven't been able to deal with the fact that you're dealing with a party which has decades of data on people who've been voting for that party, for a generation plus. They've just shown that they can kind of outdo that, which is a huge, huge deal. The local elections were massive. Labour just came 4th in local elections for the first time in the post-war era. But weirdly, I think the by-election is psychologically more important.
I mean, if I get your analysis right, Michael, when you're looking at the difference between 2015, 2016 and Reform in 2025, you're stepping back and you're going, well, look at the populist right across Europe, right? They've got tailwinds in their favour. And that's true. But is there something specific that Nigel Farage has learned or changed or adapted to in those years? First, I'm going to put that question to you, and then I want to see what you make of it, Aaron.
I mean, he's probably got better as a politician, over time. I think he's seen as less divisive now. He's now seen as more of a sort of grandee of politics, as opposed to being sort
bad
of purely
boy Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. So at the time, if you remember, sort of Dominic Cummings didn't want Brexit to be associated with him because he thought that people saw Nigel Farage as being too divisive. I'm not even sure Nigel Farage is that divisive political. I mean, he's obviously divisive in the sense that lots of people don't like him, but I don't think he's any more divisive than a normal mainstream politician. I think people look at him basically as a mainstream politician.
Completely agree. I think I think also his slot on GB News makes a massive difference. And that's the palette in which all those people now do politics, whether it's Richard Tice, whether it's Farage, whether it's a lot of their outriders in the media. It feels like watching ITV daytime. It feels like watching Loose Women, right? That's the register they're going for. He's a TV star.
Not an activist, he's a TV star.
Yeah. And that's the big change from 2019. He's a TV star. It feels, and 2016, obviously, I feel like I'm watching daytime TV. I feel like I'm watching a cultural product made for the media rather than a campaign. Reform do not feel like a campaign. It's kind of wild. I mean, I know people watched our video in Runcorn. And look, it's one constituency. We were only in one part of it for one day, but it did feel that Farage and to a lesser extent Reform, Reform is very much in his slipstream for now. He is very much part of the cultural fabric for lots of people, which is just kind of surreal. Not for everybody, but for lots of people. And, I think I'm a Celeb was a big part of that as well.
True.
And he's been on a journey towards normalization, daytime TVification.
One kangaroo testicle at a time.
Yeah, in a way that I don't think many other politicians even thought was worth pursuing. I'll finish with this. The cameos, right? Who thought that doing cameos was an effective political campaign? People thought he's a huckster, he's a grifter, he's doing it for the money. No, he's sending out hundreds of messages that go to people on their phone. They then send it to all their contacts, to WhatsApp groups. They put it on their Instagram stories. They put it on their Snap. He's probably reached an audience of hundreds of thousands through Cameo. He's paid to give tailored messages to key voter demographics, i.e. younger men. This is wild.
I mean, I think there is also, because the thing about GB News is that people watch it, or even if you don't watch it, you see his social media clips, you think of him as someone who is a broadcaster. And broadcaster, people don't like journalists, but I don't know if they mind broadcasters that much because they're just people who speak to you in your living room, right? They're your company in a way. So there's that he's got this new status, but I think also it makes you more confident speaking, right? Imagine if, Keir Starmer goes out in front of cameras, what is it, probably adds up to half an hour a week or something. Whereas Nigel Farage has been going in front of cameras for 5 to 10 hours a week for years, right? And if you're saying, how do you speak like a normal human being? You feel very how do you speak like a normal human being in front of a camera? you feel very natural in front of a camera, right? And so I think Labour probably need more people who host TV shows, to be honest, or host LBC. David Lammy had his LBC show. He is a more confident speaker than the rest of them.
Well, he's more fluid and fluent. Whereas one of the things about Keir Starmer's delivery is that it's adenoidal. It's all up here.
Well, all of the Labour front bench are
quite tight on the palate, and he sometimes does the Bill Clinton thumb like this. These kind of authoritative but staccato sentences. They're very weird. Have I ever told you about one of my in-laws? So someone who I'm very close to, family member, young man, works in a factory in a skilled machinist role, and it's one of the few unionized factories still doing this work. So if he wanted to work anywhere else, he's going to take a 20 grand pay cut. He's never voted. He's been a bit curious about reform, and his politics can be described like this. He wants weed to be legalized. He wants immigration to come down to 0. He fucking hates politicians, hates them, thinks they're all out for themselves, would like me to be prime minister, failing that Nigel Farage, right? And this is somebody who I think maybe 10 years ago, lots of people treating Farage like an outsider politician would have had an impact. He'd have been like, well, lots of my peers, lots of my friends are saying like he's this racist guy obsessed with immigration. All he wants to do is bring down immigration. Quite clearly, that is a message which appeals to him, but there are other things that he feels strongly about. Fly tipping, his community, is one that he like absolutely can't stand. And Farage is able to tap into someone like him, and someone who doesn't see himself as left wing or right wing, has a bunch of positions which are sort of gleaned from both. And so this brings me on to a question which I think maybe I'll start with you, Aaron, is how different is Reform's coalition from the one assembled by UKIP and the Brexit Party? Is it significantly different, or is it just UKIP plus being able to mirror in terms of numbers the same audience set?
Well, John Curtis said this to you yesterday, right? He said that they've basically cannibalised that 2019 Boris Johnson Leave vote. The Tories, this is a really remarkable fact, the Tories in the local elections were no more likely to attract Leave voters than Remain voters.
Wow.
They have ballsed up that part of their, I mean, they're hemorrhaging votes everywhere, so it kind of makes sense. But they are no longer a party which can actually depend in any way on Leave voters. And of course, we know the geographical kind of concentration of those Leave voters is really significant. Of course, they're not getting the Metropolitan Remain voters either, which really leaves the Tory party in a pickle. So how is Reform different to UKIP, the Brexit Party? Partly for the reasons we've already said. It's an expression of media culture. It's on the TV. I think people should really pay attention to what Zia Yusuf, the party chairman, is saying in the media. I was reading the Sunday Times, loads of really good content actually about Reform, interesting content. And they were talking to Zia Yusuf, and his focus was millennials and Gen Z. And okay, they don't need to, they might not win majorities amongst those cohorts, but they can really eat into them. And the idea that the left can just, we can just depend on millennials, we can just depend on Gen Z, I just don't think it's true. I just don't think it's true. If you're nowhere near power and you can't guarantee people getting good housing, good jobs, improved public services, better pay, I'm not saying Reform can do that, but if you're not in a position to do that and somebody else is saying they can, obviously a sensible person can understand what the appeal is. We've got an amazing comment on a show last week. Actually, no, it was in our Runcorn video. Somebody said, look, I'm inclined to vote right wing. I like Novara. I think you're fair. I live with my parents. I'm 37. What's the problem in giving Reform a chance? I think many, many people in our age cohort, many people will feel like that. And I think that's the difference between UKIP and what's happening now. That's partly an expression of the fact that status quo politics has fundamentally failed to solve big problems over the last decade.
I want to put this to you, Michael. So this was from Rachel Sylvester's piece in The Observer. Since the general election, support for Reform has almost doubled amongst Gen X women aged 45 to 60. Last July, 16% of this group backed Farage. Now it is almost a third, according to analysis by the pollsters More in Common. I guess, what do you make of this, of Reform being able to expand its vote amongst older women? Why do you think that is?
Well,
as an older woman yourself.
As an older woman myself, as a Gen X, I think, so that I don't have any data to back this up, but my sense is that UKIP support, or how I would think about them, maybe this is incorrect, is that it was more angry white people leaning angry white men. And now reform, yeah, it's still some angry white people, but it's all just people who think that nothing works. And so reform is sort of hoovering up the nothing works vote.
Yeah.
And I think this is also sort of related to how migration is discussed, because I think in the 2010s, sort of there was an ideological disagreement about migration, sort of UKIP, the Brexit Party, whoever it was. I suppose UKIP, let's do UKIP. UKIP back then, before the referendum, was saying we have too much Eastern European migration. And then the other parties were sort of a bit sort of hazy about it. Do we, don't we? We're not sure, but we're in the EU and it's good to be in the EU and have these European values, etc. There was an ideological thing there. Now it's about small votes. Every single political party says well, not the Greens, but Labour, Lib Dems, I think, the Conservatives definitely, all say we should stop the boats. And Reform have the same position. They just say, we'll do something about it. I'm not saying they'll be able to do something about it. But so the difference between, even on the issue of migration, which is the core issue of reform and why they're supposed to be divisive, the difference isn't they think migration is bad and Labour thinks it's good. It's everyone agrees it's bad and Reform are willing to do something about it. So it's very difficult to paint them as extreme. When you agree on the outcome,
so true.
They're just saying that they're not going to be so prissy when it comes to European law. Which who cares about European law anyway? As a voter.
I mean, just on that, and thinking about small boats, is that the way in which people who are left-wing, progressive, want a more liberalised migration system, they look at the small boats, as a product of failure of asylum policy. They go, asylum policy's failed. There's not enough safe and legal routes. You've created this market. Look what's happening. And they look at it as a humanitarian issue. Where most of the media is, and where most of the parties are, is they look at it as a fairness issue, right? It's presented as a form of queue jumping, right? A form of deception and sneaking. I suppose when Keir Starmer has made fairness one of his watchwords, has done for a couple of years now, fairness. How is it that Reform are so much more able to tap into people's natural sense that something unfair is going on here?
Well, they don't disagree. They all agree. But Labour are in government and they're not stopping them. And Reform is saying, well, when we're in government, we're going to stop them. So there isn't, on the fairness, on the ethics of it, they all agree. So that's why Reform can capitalise when Labour can't, because they say they'll do something about it.
Also, when Labour say smash the gangs, it's so reminiscent of Cameron on the EU. It's like, it's play for play the same. Well, we hate the EU, but we're going to change it. How? Labour, we don't like small boats, but we're going to smash the gangs. But it's just, it doesn't follow. Like the action and the end point doesn't really cohere with the analysis. Like you say, Reform, it's all much more congruent, makes much more intuitive sense there. I think the small boats thing is extraordinary. And I think it does go hand in hand with post-COVID immigration. And I think the left has to be honest, the quantity of immigration post-COVID is just, it's much higher, right? So I think in 2023, a net migration to this country of 906,000 people. That's not the same as like the boom Blair years of the mid-2000s, like peak multiculturalism.
It's triple, isn't it? So it was.
Yeah, I mean, it is triple. It's really, really high, 906,000 people. And so if you just had one of those things in isolation, I think you might have a bit more of a sensible debate on this stuff. But when you've got small boats and you're seeing record net migration, when you've just had the Tories win a huge mandate, I think they got their most votes since 1987, they're saying they'll cut migration. And then you get 906,000 net migration, 1.5 million in 2 years. It's the median Conservative voter, who's now becoming very quickly the median Reform voter. I mean, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It does make perfect sense. It does make perfect sense. And you combine that with Labour's kind of non-position on this stuff. We think it's really important, but there's no real action being offered. You can see why Reform all of a sudden are winning a local election.
I think Liberals have a real problem. And I think the reason why the small boats is, well, obviously it's become a toxic issue because there are right-wing media channels that want to give it undue focus. Nigel Farage went down to the beaches and sort of kept taking pictures.
He turned it into a media issue.
He was the one who created the story. But I think one of the reasons it has sort of caught on and does infuriate people is because the Liberal story about refugees and asylum doesn't really make sense. It's to say, we are going to throw everything at this problem to make it as difficult as possible to get here. So we're going to pay off authoritarian dictatorships in Libya or wherever. And they're going to try and stop you. They're going to try and put you in detention centers. And we're going to build some walls on the outside of Europe. But that's going to try and stop you, but you might get through. And then we're going to try and sort of put down all of your dinghies on the Calais beaches. And hopefully that's going to stop you. But if you get through all of our obstacles, you probably can stay. And that's obviously, I'm not saying once you get here.
That's a liberal position, sure. But then you've got a sort of left-wing progressive argument, which is about safe and legal routes, being able to apply from asylum from your country of origin, so on and so forth.
Well, except that, that still won't stop the boats. But yeah, I mean, well, it wouldn't. So that I don't have really a position on this because I think it's just a genuinely really difficult problem where none of the stories really make sense. Because the issue of saying we'll have safe routes and that will solve the problem is either, I think morally, absolutely you should have safe routes. I think the moral position and politically, actually, you should have safe routes. But I don't think it solves the political problem. Because either you have a system whereby you're so liberal in accepting people as asylum seekers that the numbers are way too big and no one's going to accept it, or the kind of people crossing in small boats are not going to get accepted via the safe routes, so they're still going to come via the small boats. Do you see what I mean? So, so you've got the same political problem almost doubled, which is why Labour won't do that, unless there is something done about irregular migration as a quid pro quo.
While Reform are in, they're not in government, they're taking the place, really, of the Conservatives as the opposition, if not constitutionally and officially, certainly when it comes to creating political space. While they're not in government, they can say what they want, right? So Andrea Jenkyns can say, we want asylum seekers in tents outside so they can die of diphtheria. She didn't say die of diphtheria, but that is what happens. That is what happens when you put asylum seekers in overcrowded tents. And even if Keir Starmer was to say, all right, fine, we're gonna bring back this sort of shambolic, cruel, deterrent style accommodation, Reform can say, well, we'll put them on the moon, right? There's nothing really to stop them escalating each time to make sure that they are, outriding to the right of the government and the Conservative Party. Is there a danger in that? And I'm saying for them, from them, that they once more go down the path of UKIP, where they become so obsessed with demographic replacement, with mass deportation, so on and so forth, that they're not able to appeal to that mainstream, former Tory or Labour voter that Nigel Farage really, really wants.
I mean, if they get obsessed with demographics and remigration and all of that, then yeah. But Nigel Farage is like really staying away from that now. He's quite. There are divisions on the right. Like sometimes you speak to people on the right and they hate Nigel Farage because he doesn't think that the Great Replacement is happening. Right? He very explicitly says, maybe he believes it. I don't know what he believes, but he's very keen to sort of distance himself from the demographic question. I think if Reform got onto power, they'd probably rip up the Refugee Convention.
Aaron, I want to put this question to you because you were in Runcorn for Novara Media.
Beautiful Runcorn.
Because there is another way of looking at last week's set of results. So Labour managed to retain the Doncaster mayoralty by about 1%. Reform won Runcorn by just 6 votes. And we often talk about politics through the lens of the air war, right? So what's going on in terms of national political media stories. But there is also a ground game. And I've seen this firsthand because one of my best friends was the Green candidate in Tottenham St Anne's. He won. And what I saw was that over the course of the campaign, he had to build up the data picture from zero. So the Greens had basically no data for that ward about where their voters were. And so he had to build that up whilst campaigning at the same time. And it is hard. It is so Labour intensive to find where your voters are. Now, for Labour and the Conservatives, they will have years and years, if not decades, of data banked for where their most reliable voters are, where their local elections voters are. It's a very particular kind of person who votes in a local election rather than a general election. How do Reform make up for that disadvantage? And is what we saw last week proof that maybe that advantage in terms of data simply doesn't matter when the national picture is so dire?
So Reform are definitely building an organisation. This is something that Zia Yusuf said over the weekend. He said, we are building an organisation, a mass membership organisation of hundreds of thousands of people. They want to be a bigger membership organisation than the Labour Party. And I think their ambition is 3 or 4 years' time to have something that can compete with that. One thing we're not mentioning is, of course, the Brexit campaign in 2016, which probably to this day remains, maybe the exception of the 2019 Tory campaign, to this day remains the most impressive analytics-led political campaign in this country. That was not done by a legacy organisation. That was done by an insurgent upstart. So I don't see why Reform can't do the same thing. I also think you ally that to the fact they have a huge advantage in the press, which the right has always had. And historically, that's been counterbalanced by the liberal left basically being the politics of broadcast media, basically. GB News have upset that balance. Their sell is that they say, look, liberals basically infuse Channel 4, BBC, ITV. Broadly true. Broadly true. Sky, broadly true. They're
Centre left, centre right.
Yeah, they're kind of New Labour people or David Cameron people, exactly. To be clear, they're not left wing. They might be socially liberal. That's kind of right. And their shtick is we want to counterbalance that. Of course, that doesn't take into account that they have also the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Sun, and so on. Quickly, in response to what Michael said as well about Reform, saying they'll get rid of, I think they'll scrap asylum. I think they will literally come in, I think within 100 days, they will literally get rid of the idea of asylum. If you want to accept 100,000 people from Ukraine or 200,000 people from Hong Kong, you'd have to do it by an act of, which I think they'd be open to doing. You'd have to do it by act of parliament. Or this year, we want to take 20,000 people from Afghanistan because they're translators. You'll do that by act of parliament. I think they will literally get rid of the right to asylum. And here's something to think about. You were saying about, will Farage lose more moderate voters if he leans into the remigration stuff, deportation, blah, blah, blah? I think he will. That's why he's made that clear distinction between him and Tommy Robinson and even Rupert Lowe. But my real concern, and it's not going to happen that quickly, but I think maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, is that brown and black people who've been settled here for a long time get so worried about how racism is going to get because of the temperature rising. They'll say, look, because of asylum policies, because of the small boats, because of even legal migration, it's leading to such toxic outcomes. For my own rational self-interest, I don't want to be racially abused. And they might not overtly say this, but this is the thought process. I don't want my kids to be racially abused. Maybe actually Britain being 80% white really is like, let's just, leave it there. It's in my rational self-interest. And I would not be surprised, and I think this will probably happen before the next general election, but it will definitely be something in the 2030s to think about, if they become more likely to vote for nativist, anti-immigration parties, certainly in this country, than middle-class white people. I think that's really, really plausible because the situation is going to get so bad. And I see it already amongst my dad's friends. Many of them are saying they're going to vote for Reform because they have a status, they've worked hard for it, they identify as being integrated, they broadly speaking don't receive racist abuse, and they think I could lose all of that because the political class is intent on going in this direction. And also I earn a few brownie points by, saying, let's pull the ladder up. And that's effectively what that politics is.
No pun intended, Aaron.
No, but that's what that politics is. And I think that's going to happen. And I think the left is really, it's going to be really strange if you start saying to Iranians and Somalis and Nigerians and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, it's going to look really strange if white middle class people start calling those guys racist. It's going to look really weird.
I mean, I think that there is a fair comparison there with what we saw with the, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump campaign just last year. So while Donald Trump won clear majorities amongst, especially white, non-college educated Americans, he was able to increase his vote amongst basically everyone that doesn't have college education, including African Americans, including, Latino people, et cetera, et cetera. College, non-college education was like the big dividing line. Race is still in there, but was being broken down. And part of it, when journalists would go and interview Trump voters of color, one was an extreme sense of disappointment and disgust for the Democrats. A sense of, you said you were going to improve the economy. You said you were going to deal with the cost of living. It hasn't been done. I'm experiencing a sense of economic national decline. And the second thing, and this was something which was especially pronounced amongst some Hispanic groups, is okay, well, you, white progressive, you're trying to lump me in, someone who's got, a green card, a settled status, might even be second or third generation. Yeah. You're trying to lump me in with someone who is, trying to cross the border and isn't documented. And we are not the same. Like, we are not the same. So I think that there are comparisons to be made there with the American picture, and especially how pronounced that becomes in the absence of a proper project of wealth redistribution. I mean, Michael, what do you reckon of Aaron's prediction that you're going to see increasing numbers of settled Black and brown British people turning towards reform in the coming years?
I think increasing numbers is plausible. I mean, I suppose with the Trump campaign, we talked about this on one of our end of year downstreams, didn't we? Which is that I think what was striking there is that Donald Trump, who everyone thought was the most racist Republican candidate of all time, got the most votes of Black people in the 21st century for a Republican. So it's always really important to say Black people in America overwhelmingly vote Democrat, right? So Blacks for Trump is still very much a minority thing. But clearly people of color weren't more offended by Donald Trump than they were by George W. Bush. So the kind of things which I suppose especially sort of like middle-class liberal people found particularly appalling about Donald Trump wasn't necessarily sort of shared by the majority of voters. And I think you might see a similar thing with Nigel Farage, which is that while you have highly educated people looking at him and thinking he's sort of, somehow much worse than David Cameron. Offensive. Yeah, it might be that, that's not really felt by your average working class person in Britain of any race, that he's worse than your bog standard centre-right politician. I see that as perfectly plausible.
Aaron, very quickly, and then I'm going to move us on.
So in response to what you said about Trump and Latino voters saying, I'm not those guys, it really sticks in my mind. One of my dad's friends, Iranian, he did his military service, came to the UK. He said, I was a gentleman. I waited. He was in France. I waited to get my visa to come here, and I married an English woman. And now, I was a gentleman. These aren't gentlemen. It's a very Iranian way to look at things. But I do think that in the background to all of this is the country going to shit. That same guy would say, when I was driving a taxi in Bournemouth 22 years ago for the first time in 2000, the place was completely different. It was booming and it's collapsed. Tourism's collapsed, living standards have collapsed. High Street looks like absolute, crap. Public services have collapsed. It's filthy. Basic sanitation and cleaning doesn't happen anymore. And I think that feeds in. This is all additive, right? There's the identity. I'm better than these guys. And you know what? Things look so bad. Give it a shot. So there are some things that motivate brown and Black voters, which are very similar to white voters. But I do think that's that added layer. So I'm not saying it's that one thing that's going to push them to Farage or reform. But I do think, I think, and that's underneath all of this, what drives the majority of these people is, can it get that much worse? Can it get, how much do people in this country have to lose? I think if they thought, okay, well, Farage and reform means my house price will lose value, then that's different. Or, interest rates go up, then that's different. Or my pension, maybe get rid of the triple lock, I'll be upset. But absent those things, I think most people are at a point now where they say, well, you know what, let's try it.
I want to put this question first to you, Michael, which is about the splits and divisions within reform. So not that long before the local elections, there was a very acrimonious divorce, shall we say, between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. And I think you can sort of sum it up as Rupert Lowe was more comfortable with the far right element, was a bit more open to admitting Tommy Robinson into the party, won the endorsement of Elon Musk, and you could tell that inflated his head a little bit. It's already a big fucking head. To what extent do you think figures like Rupert Lowe or Ben Habib, who are sort of prowling around the perimeter, what kind of threat do you think they pose to Nigel Farage's vision for the party?
I would guess very, very little. So it seems to me that, there's a difference between saying Nigel Farage is an effective politician and saying he's a good guy and I'm not terrified of him winning a general election. But I think the fact that he cut himself off from that section of the right, which is abhorrent to most people, sort of shows that he's probably fairly effective. I mean, a big difficulty he'll have is sort of building, because you have to staff a party with a lot of people, right? So there'll be a logistical challenge in terms of how to keep those people out. But I don't think that Rupert Lowe is going to form a sort of far-right party which cares not about migration but about race and demographics, which maybe that is what Nigel Farage cares about, but he's not going to say that, and he's very explicitly going to distance himself from that. And I don't think there will be a split on the right at the next general election, because you've either got Nigel Farage, who's the anti-migrant politician, or Rupert Lowe plus Tommy Robinson, who thinks that sort of we need to relitigate whether brown people can be English, right? Which is that's that very online section of the right. They want to bring those questions about race back to the top of the agenda, and Farage doesn't. And I don't think they will have much traction. I mean, remember at the time there was when was it? When it was the last European elections probably, so maybe it was 2019, where Tommy Robinson was doing really, really well on YouTube. And sort of I remember being quite worried because like, God, this guy is so extreme and he's getting millions of views, millions of Twitter followers, huge online. He stood in those European elections. I think he got less than 1%. So
he didn't do well.
He didn't do well. But I mean, it wasn't just that he lost. It was a pathetic showing. And I do think that probably Farage understands that very that more extreme section of the online right that wants to relitigate basic questions about race doesn't have much traction in the country. And so he can just dismiss them and ignore them, essentially.
I mean, Reform launched their campaign this year at Blenheim Palace, the birthplace of Winston Churchill. You know, the Duke of Marlborough, that's where his family is. Like, they are coming for the establishment. They want to administer the British state. That's a really serious way to do things. That is not like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe on X. You know, that's really fucking heavyweight and serious. And I think, however, that despite that, people like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe help Farage. Because ultimately, it doesn't hurt his cause to have a small cluster of crackpots who were further right than him, and him saying, I'm not those guys, come on, I'm sensible, I'm a mainstream, sensible guy. I'm
Having someone battier than you always helps.
Yeah, I'm like the Conservatives 30 years ago. That's always that's the line, right? It's like Trump, you know, I'm like a mainstream Republican 30 years ago. So I think they help him. And I think that right now you do have this media industrial complex on the right, which is just churning out influencers and stars. They are, because they've got the apparatus to do it. The left hasn't got the apparatus to do it. We do it a little bit, you know, with organizations like Novara and whatnot. We do it a little bit, but not like them. And so I think in that universe, that cinematic daytime TV universe of right-wing influencers and politicians and journalists, you know, having Julia Hartley-Brewer criticize Reform and the Tories, probably be a bit more Reform-friendly, and having Rupert Lowe saying mad things about you, I think that all helps Farage look like a very mainstream, legitimate political actor.
Again, that's why just as GB News, just like X, was one of those things where people said, mad investment, never going to make money. Neither of them will ever make money.
That's not the
but
point.
That you've purchased so much influence. And I think with GB News, it's not just that you've got this channel which streams into people's televisions and they watch passively. I think that's what's important, because people don't watch Novara Media passively, really. You have to sort of find us and tune into it. As you watch that passively, which one sort of reaches more sort of people who are less politically engaged, but also gives it this different valence because it feels more sort of comfortable and less threatening. But also you just train up this whole sort of cohort of potential politicians and potential influencers. Yeah. Because you're 24 hours, you have this challenge where you constantly have to have someone in front of the screen. Yeah.
I mean, look, I've been saying this for a long time. The distinction between media and politics has collapsed. Like it has completely collapsed. And before I put my next question to you, Aaron, I just want to say two things. The first thing is a little bit of housekeeping. We are taking super chats and we're taking your questions this evening. So if you want to put a question to us, we've got about 15 minutes at the end of the show where we're going to rattle through them at lightning speed. And the second thing is that I'm really proud of the work that we do here, and I'm really proud of the fact that we take Reform quite seriously. We're interested in their politics, we're interested in their strategy, and we're interested in getting inside their heads. And I think that there's a tendency in a lot of media to just see whatever it is you want to see. And the incentives for motivated reasoning are so strong, right? Because, you want to move with the herd. You want to say the same thing that all the other journalists are saying. You want to say the things which are comforting to your audience. And I'm really proud of the fact that we don't do that. And if it's something that you find helpful, if it's something which has shaped your understanding of British politics or indeed the world, you know what I'm going to say. Go to novaramedia.com/support. We appreciate anything that you can give us. And if you go to novaramedia/support, it means that Google doesn't take like a third of it. So thank you. Really appreciate everything you've done to help us build the organization so far. Aaron, I want to put this question to you. And it's about a potential division within Reform's coalition rather than anything that we've seen play out right now, which is, as you've pointed out, part of the reason why Reform has been able to do so well in these last local elections is because nothing fucking works. And local government in particular is a basket case. And an awful lot of money in local government goes on services that most people will never have to use. And it's because instead of it being funded through general taxation, central government's being kicked down to local authorities. So things like adult social care, children's social care takes up an awful lot of the budgets. And when it comes to things like fly tipping, being able to, see firsthand the degradation of your streets, something which everyone can see, pisses them off. But here's a difference between voters and Nigel Farage, which is voters want to see all these things improved, not through council tax going up, but there's a broad consensus for a wealth tax. They just want this stuff dealt with. Nigel Farage wants further cuts to local government budgets. Do you think that's going to cause him a problem at some point?
Probably.
Before 2029?
No. I think there's a hell of a lot of headlines to be made out of running authorities. We're already seeing it, right? Darren Grimes and Farage are saying, we won't do the DEI training, we won't do the climate change training. I'm sure they'll take on high-paying local authorities, which, by the way, is a real thing. I think £1 in £4 of council tax goes towards the pensions of local government employees. £1 in £4, quite extraordinary. And then, of course, in terms of overall expenditure, a hell of a lot goes as well to social care. I think in Hampshire County Council, 74% of spending, this is not typical, but it's the highest. 74% of spending by that authority goes to adult and child social care. 74%. It's a very old place. And what's interesting is that Reform, I think demographically, are going to be the most likely to administer older local authorities because for now, their vote skews a bit older, not Greater Manchester or Greater London, etc. And so they are going to be in this very strange position of wanting to shrink the state, but also having to deal with, the ground zero of an aging population. And by the way, it's very hard to have low tax, low immigration policies when you have an aging population. You can square that circle. You can make certain policy choices to get around it, but it would take lots of public investment, and I don't think they're willing to do it. So I do think demographic aging is the big challenge to Reform's sort of mode of politics and ideology. Is that going to catch up with them before 2029? I doubt it. I really do doubt it. I'd also say that the big difference between the left and someone like Reform isn't about high or low council tax, isn't even about public services. It's about ownership. Let me give you the example of Portsmouth Port. Portsmouth has a publicly owned port. It, I think, brought in last year about £8 million worth of profit. That allows you to pay for certain public services. Down the road, Southampton Port, privatised. Okay? So Southampton has higher council tax. They have to do all sorts of things like dim their lights earlier than Portsmouth and whatnot. So I think that's where you make the case for public ownership as a means to having lower council tax, as a means to having better public services. That's the terrain where the left is much, much stronger. But because of 40 years of liberal hegemony on the centre-left, we've not been able to make those arguments. We tried to do it with Corbynism. We got smashed, let's be honest. But I think that's the terrain where we are on our strongest footing when it comes to people like Reform. You're already seeing them cower a little bit because, of course, people like Richard Tice are saying, maybe water nationalisation isn't so bad, or Farage saying maybe steel nationalisation isn't so bad in Scunthorpe. I think that ownership is the big Achilles heel with Reform now.
Michael, I want to put a quick question to you and then a final quick question to you, Aaron, before we move on to our audience questions. There are those within Labour, particularly the Blue Labour faction, who say, look, there's no way to derail reform's momentum without taking on immigration, without bringing down immigration, without making it harder to claim asylum. Literally anything else is just cope. I mean, what do you make of that argument?
Well, I mean, I think the next general election is going to be a 5-way fight, right? Which means that it's very difficult to say that you can't win without doing X, because there are so many different ways to win, right? If you can get a stomping majority, like Labour got a stomping majority with 33% at the last general election. At the next general election, a party could get a stomping majority with 30%, right? Clearly, Labour could just appeal to Green and Lib Dem voters and get a majority. That's absolutely within the realms of possibility. Whether or not you can defeat the surge in right-wing populism that we're seeing everywhere without having some kind of answer on immigration, I think is a different issue. I obviously don't think that should be front and centre of Labour's pitch. Labour's pitch should be, we're going to tax the wealthy and rebuild Britain. We're going to train up hundreds of thousands of people to create good jobs so that we can build stuff and make stuff work. That should be the policy platform. But I do think that one of the reasons you have seen sort of the rise of right-wing populism across Europe, which isn't a one-off. I think people for a while were hoping, oh, maybe it will sort of jump up and then everyone will realize it doesn't work and then it will go. It's not going away. So I think maybe 2029, Labour could win in so many different ways. I'm not as dismissive of the blue Labour argument as many people are, I suppose.
I mean, Aaron, I'm going to...
As long as you do economic populism at the same time. The problem at the moment with the people doing the blue Labour think pieces is that Labour are already quite blue on migration. The thing they're not doing is the economic populism. So to now come out and say they should be more right-wing on migration, it's sort of like, that's the thing they're all ready to... If that's what you want, you've already got it, right? You need them to do some economic populism at the same time.
I want to put the final question to you, which is, don't yell at me because I know you don't like coarse language, but have Reform perhaps blown their load too soon? Right? Have they peaked too soon? It's the last local elections, the best they're going to do. It's a long time between now and 2029. People get fatigued. People get bored of the same face. There are scandals. Anything can happen. Keir Starmer tomorrow could say, yo, winter fuel allowance, that's coming back. A lot can happen. What do you think the chances are of this being the peak of Reform, what we've just seen?
Highly unlikely. I think lots of people in this country want to be excited about something politically. They want to be. They're looking for something to be excited about. I think, by the way, that's why Labour formed a majority. You're right, they only got 33% of the vote, but they still got lots of people. I don't quite get it because I kind of felt this was all inevitable, but I could have been wrong, right? Lots of people were getting excited about that. Lots of people out there are looking for something to be excited about. You saw it with Johnson as well in 2019. And I think that it boils down to the capacity of Reform to build an organisation, to build a cadre of people. And I listen to what Zia Youssef has to say. I see what they've done with GB News and Paul Marshall, who's a very ambitious man. He's buying other outlets too. They are very serious about building organisations. And I think that's the big shift over the last 20 years. You know, the left was always serious about building organisations. And with social media, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, with social media and, you know, digital technologies over the last 20 years, all of a sudden the left didn't bother about building organisations anymore. Everything could just be ad hoc social networks. And, you know, I think if you're going to claw back any kind of significant place in national political life, you have to learn that lesson.
They did also have 40 billion quid. Not billion, sorry, 40 million quid
40 million.
to sink into a channel.
Well, I mean, that's true. That's true. But Just the Paul, I think, in 1 year got, you know, I think £1.5 million.
Yeah, but 40 million, 1.5. You can't start a channel with 1.5 million.
You know what? If Novara Media had £1.5 million, I think our footprint would be, in 1 year, we could do a hell of a lot. So I agree with you. I do agree with you, but allocation of resources really, really matters. It really matters. And I don't think, and the left has massive resources. You look at the trade union movement, you look at all kinds of money that's funneled into different places. Stop Brexit, the people's vote. That was the Liberal left, Michael. I think 5 or 6 million was pumped into that in 12 months.
Yeah, but that was a campaign to bring down Corbyn and they were very successful.
Well, I know, but you're saying there's no...
perspective, that was money
spent. No, but you're saying there's no money there. No, but those same people presumably don't want Farage to lead a government in 2029. So the resources are there in all sorts of parts of the country and right across the ideological spectrum. And Paul Marshall, like you say, people were saying he's wasted his money. That was not, and even some right-wingers have said that to me privately, and I'm thinking, what the hell are you talking about? That is going to have such an impact on the country's broadcast environment. What are you talking about?
I'm going to move us along to questions and comments from our audience. So if you want to hear Michael and Aaron disagree about something, put something contentious in the chat. Think about how we divide these two men. I've been trying to do it for years. Nothing's worked so far. This is from Blah de la Blah. Reform did very well, mostly because of the collapse of the Conservatives. Of course, most of the councils up for contestation were Conservative held, so they had the most to lose. Will the Conservatives recover before the next national election? Michael, let's start with you.
No, I would say no. I mean, I suppose what have they got? Their record makes it very difficult for them to win back their vote. I mean, they can't. Like people keep saying, oh, they'll go to the right of reform on migration. It's very difficult to go to the right of reform on migration. And also their record before leaving government was the so-called Boris wave of having net migration of almost 1 million people. So I don't think they can. Also, they don't have a personality to match Nigel Farage. Interesting polling. The only leader who could sort of have the Conservatives overtake reform was Boris Johnson if they brought him back. Yeah, I think the only way for the Tories to compete with reform would probably be to bring back Boris Johnson. We live in an attention economy, and no one, like Robert Jenrick, thinks he's like the bee's knees. And I think like maybe he's willing to take policy positions which read as a bit bolder than Kemi Badenoch. But why would you vote for Robert Jenrick over Nigel Farage? I don't understand the pitch.
Well, I think he's a Hail Mary in terms of the party not collapsing. I think that's probably what they've got to aim for, right?
Yeah.
And I think, no, the Tories aren't coming back. To repeat what I said earlier on, it's almost hard to convey what it must be like as a Conservative voter when you're told from David Cameron in 2010, we're going to bring immigration into the tens of thousands. Boris Johnson, we're going to, oversee a drastic transformation of the British state. I'm going to give you everything you want. And then 3 years later, you have net migration of almost 1 million people. Why would you ever trust that party again? It's like, this is the analogy here, right? For people who are on the left watching or listening. It's like Jeremy Corbyn winning the 2017 general election saying, I'm going to bring all this stuff into public ownership, we're going to tax the rich. And then he privatises the NHS. It's the exact same. Why would you trust that party again? So I think the Tories are very much a busted flush. They may come back in 2034 or whatever, but in 2029, no, they're out of the picture.
What happened to Kemi Badenoch? Because she was being hyped up by the likes of Michael Gove, people in The Spectator. She's a new kind of politician, Nigerian heritage, Bolshi. I mean, the thing about Kemi Badenoch, people always said, is that she could start a fight in an empty room. And now, I mean, it's just like, a quiet fart in a gale force wind. You can't hear her, right? She's nowhere. She's too busy picking fights with Doctor Who. I mean, do you think that in an attempt to, sort of salvage their party's credit with reform curious voters, that the Conservatives could be induced to defenestrate one leader and bring in someone like Robert Jenrick, who's, clearly been on the Matt Goodwin diet?
He has run a marathon as well. So it's not necessarily just like Ozempic or something like that.
I didn't say Ozempic. I didn't accuse anyone of taking Ozempic.
I keep hearing, I assumed it was Ozempic, and then I saw he'd run a marathon, and I was like, well,
You do both.
You can do both.
What's
What's Ozempic like for muscle mass? I don't know.
I think that's what the NHS actually would sort of say. Or it might be Manjaro, who knows?
Look, I'm not accusing anyone of taking Ozempic. When I said Matt Goodwin diet, I was talking in terms of his political positioning.
Can I quickly
Michael.
say something though?
Yeah.
Matt Goodwin backed Kemi Badenoch. That shows you how. Yeah, that shows you how quickly things move. Now he's on the TV saying she's awful.
He's also campaigning for reform now.
Well, that's a whole separate thing. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of remarkable how quickly. I mean, Kemi Badenoch was the golden girl of the Tory right, and now they're like, oh, okay, see you later. It's like Toy Story. Bye bye.
There was kind of my read of it is partly that within Conservative circles, when DEI was still sort of the subject of relitigation, she could sort of put forward an intellectual argument against DEI as a black woman, which sort of people read as intellectually interesting and impressive. But politics has moved on since then.
Let us move on to another question from Fabius Gallus, who donated 20 CH. I don't know what that currency is.
Cha.
20 cha.
20 cha.
I mean, look, 20 is a good number of anything, unless it's yen, in which case it's not very many yen. Could you spend a moment and talk about the increasing gender divide in politics? How could the left win over young men? Again, I'm not a young man, and you two technically still are clinging on in there by the skin of your teeth. Aaron, let's start with you.
Well, Michael is, I'm not. You're seeing a massive divergence amongst younger men and younger women. It's driven, I think, primarily by social media consumption. By the way, that's one of the reasons why people should support Novara Media, okay? Because we are not interested in polarizing people by age, identity, etc. I think this has been a big failure of the left, actually, again, over the last 20 years. I talked about organization and not believing in it. Another one is leaning into polarization. And I think the left did lean into polarization on this stuff. I think
the wrong polarization.
The wrong polarization, not the good polarization. Not when if you can win, polarize, but if you're going to lose, probably not wise. And I think...
Did you intend that to rhyme?
Yeah. No, I didn't. I was a poet, but I didn't know it. I think, yeah.
I'm sorry, after the show, we are going to take Aaron to the vets and have him put down.
I do think that on the on that stuff, I think the left made mistakes, myself included, right? Nobody's perfect. But there now needs to be a big political effort to listen to young men and also to generate a politics that caters to their needs. They're not aliens. And I do think they should be listened to as well. I think this whole thing of like, the left needs a Joe Rogan, I think kind of misses the point. You know, the left already has an authentic politics. The point is, you know, you need to cut that diamond, you need to polish it. I think we're looking at somebody who's, you know,
I don't know.
Who's good at that.
I mean, Gary Stevenson's a good example of someone who's been very good at that. I would say he's a much more Joe Rogan character than... I think you've got a bit more masculine energy than I've got.
Well, I
can handle a kettlebell.
I tell you what's a bit Joe Rogan is. Before we went live, me and Aaron were just doing what is a very blokey thing where we would just look at each other. We were like, Luis Figo. And then you'd be like, oh, best front three in football history. Ronaldo, Rivaldo, what was it? Ronaldinho as well.
2002.
Like, it was very, very blokey. It's just like you start just naming sports stars and athletes. But then that's enough for a conversation.
But then I do the sort of metrosexual coded thing of saying, Luis Figo is so handsome.
That's very Hassan Piker, isn't it?
It's very Hassan Piker, very Hassan Piker. I mean, but on this, I guess like winning back young men or being able to speak to some of the alienation of young men. As a young man yourself, Michael.
I mean, I suppose is it because obviously there was a moment where you could definitely blame the left for it, for sort of constantly going on about privilege, etc., etc. I feel like that moment has passed.
Yeah.
And so if the gender divide continues, probably sort of the time for self-flagellation has ended, and we should sort of look at more structural causes and work out sort of what's really going on.
You know what I think a big thing is, and I know that this is my hobby horse, and I like to take it out the stable and ride it every day. I think a big factor is online dating. And the way in which, and when I'm talking about online dating, I'm not talking about Match.com, I'm talking about Hinge, Bumble,
I said Match.com and looked at Aaron like, no, it's not like Match.com, the kind of thing that you might have used when you were still dating.
I'm a shareholder.
We're talking about things on smartphones.
Crank up the computer using a winch like this. After a long day out in the fields.
Dial-up connection. I could meet my wife.
I'm so sorry. It's because he mentioned Match.com when we were talking earlier. But I think that online dating is particularly bad, and I'm going to tell you why. Firstly, is that where you do find that 80% of women, 20% of men thing, it's on online dating, and they build it into the algorithm. So a friend of mine who's still on the apps, she's my inside woman. She was like, well, look, what they do is that they rank you by attractiveness as a woman, and they just show you, who they think you're going to, who's really your level. And they're mostly schlubs. And then when you're thinking about deleting the app and when you're running out of hope, and they can tell, they throw you, someone from their A class. And all the women go for them. So that's a place where like it is playing out. The second thing is that I think that the experiences of online dating are really quite shit for both heterosexual men and heterosexual women, which I think has also driven a sort of polarization and almost like radicalization. So if you go on TikTok and if you go on social media spaces, which are very much catered for women, the advice that you get about men is fucking insane. Like, it is so crazy. It's he should be paying for this, this, and this. Otherwise, he doesn't respect you.
What if he's got no money?
Well, it's also like, congratulations, ladies, you've invented prostitution. Right? Well done. Feminism. A discourse which is so centered on red flags and icks and reasons to reject people. And the thing is that this doesn't stay locked in on TikTok. Like, it filters out. It becomes a way in which men understand women, their desires, because everyone's scared of rejection. Everyone's scared of rejection. And then you've got fucking crazy shit that is, being pumped out to men about women and what women want, which bears no real relationship to women's desires. And so, I think that the role of dating apps, the marketization of love and romance, and also the way in which social media develops these completely polarized information universes for heterosexual men and for heterosexual women is nuts. And I just think you gotta find your partner the old-fashioned way. Sleep with your friends. Next question. From Joe Brindle with a tenner. Zach Polanski is running for Green leadership with a left eco-populism pitch. What one thing do you think the Greens would need to do to make this work? I mean, Michael, you interviewed him yesterday for Novara Live. What's one crazy trick for the Greens?
What one thing? I mean, it depends what they want. So I suppose I was impressed by Zach actually with the interview yesterday, but I did think that, and I think you get this on the left and with sort of the Greens quite a lot, is that there's a move in the goal. So I was sort of in the pitch, so saying, I want to appeal to reform voters, or I'm going to take on reform. And so then in the interview, I'm saying, well, might there be some compromises you need to make with your base to take on reform? And his answer was, I think there's a lot of dissatisfied Labour voters we can take on without compromising any of our priors. Is that, well, yeah, you've sort of switched here. So I think I think the Greens can very easily do very well by eating into Labour's votes and Lib Dem votes. And I think that will be very important for the political debate and political discourse in this country, because I do think a lack of left leadership is dragging political conversation to the right, and that is a problem. How that plays out in an electoral scenario is a lot more mixed, because obviously if the principal thing you do as an eco-populist is divide the non-reform vote, then it's unclear what's the benefit at election day. So I think there is this tension, I think, between sort of pulling political conversation to some degree to the left, but then also at the same time, sort of in essence, you will end up dividing the left. That's why I was sort of trying to push him to focus on economics and maybe really downplay some of the cultural divides, which I felt like he seemed not keen to do, which is understandable as a Green Party politician. But for me, for sort of a left populist to come along who can not only drag the political conversation to the left, but also threaten reform, not be in some way a sort of electoral gift for them, you have to put class front and center and compromise on other things, even if that gets people in your base or on Twitter mad at you.
I mean, it's very difficult in a party where your membership decides
every policy. Yeah.
Aaron, I want to put this question to you from Turn Left. Given the Greens may have a ceiling, pro-Remain, name is Green, is the answer a new left populist party to take on reform?
Before 2029, I don't really see that happening. I mean, or there would be a party, but I can't see it finding massive scale that quickly. You know, I think the Greens could go to, say, 15 seats in the next election if they had a really knockout general election. There might be a hung parliament. They could be in a government potentially, right? Or some kind of confidence and supply arrangement. I'm not a member of the Greens. I don't plan to join the Greens. I voted Green in the last election. I think there's a huge space for a new party of the left, but I just wouldn't trust the left to start it. Because for the precise reasons Michael's talked about, and this was a real learning experience for me with Corbynism. You know, I really profoundly believed in membership-led democracy in the Labour Party. People attack Corbyn for being a bad leader, bad manager, bad at politics. None of that's true. On the big issue, Brexit, the Labour membership was wrong. If you want to get a majority in a general election in 2019, you don't do what they want. And because of a bunch of variables, he did. He had little choice. Partly,
he could have taken the membership with him if he'd explicitly said in 2017, let's do a soft Brexit.
No,
Instead, he prevaricated for years.
That's all true. And he could have done like back me or sack me.
Yeah.
Right. I think he could have done all of that. But also your point about listening to the activists online. You know, if Farage was listening to activists online, he would have agreed with Rupert Lowe and probably would have got, you know, a much less impressive result at these local elections. You do have to have...
Yeah, he'd have been referring to Muslims as Mohammedans or something
Yeah,
crazy.
exactly. It sounds like Calvin Robinson. You do have to have an ability to sometimes ignore the noise, focus on the objective, focus on the mission. Now, Labour think they're doing that. Starmer thinks he's doing that. I'm zoning out the noise. They've got it very badly wrong. But sometimes that's the case. And in terms of Zach, you know, saying one thing, buy a ring light. I was watching the interview last night. The guy, it was like it was pitch black. So that's the first thing, buy a ring light. But secondly, if you want to take on Nigel Farage, you have to be one slick bastard, right? Male or female. The only people I can think about having those competencies on the green left, Caroline in Brighton and Hove.
She's got, you mean Sean Berry in Brighton and Hove now?
No, Caroline Lucas.
But she's not
She's
actually
out.
anymore.
Quite.
But she could come back.
Quite. Caroline Lucas, she's got it. Dale Vince, he's got it.
I think Dale Vince is the eco-populist.
Or Chris Packham, right? Chris Packham, not many people know this. Chris Packham used to have I think he had a DB9. He had a he's into supercars. So the dude likes supercars, but also, you know, was arrested in Malta because he was trying to protect wildlife. I think that to me is like a green populist.
I think to be a good...
Which is also not, because the audience might be being like, but none of them are running. This isn't an argument against Zach Polanski.
No. I think that to be a green populist, or to be any kind of populist or left-wing populist, you have to be a mad bastard. You have to be a shark, and you have to be someone who swims toward blood rather than away from it. And I think that in order to get there, and I know this is so micro, but it's the kind of detail that I notice, is that he's got to break himself of a couple of habits. One is when he wants to buy himself time to respond to a hard question, he does a classic politician thing, which goes, I'm really glad you asked me that. Nobody is glad to be asked a question like that. Nobody is glad. And it's something which you get from media training. Get rid. And being able to hone your communication, right? Think like a shark, be a shark. That would be my advice. I'm going to quickly rattle through some of your comments. We've got Ishtak with a super chat of $4.99. Thank you very much. Great lighting tonight. You know what? We had an extended discussion about this before going live, in which I may have accused all of my colleagues of racism for not making me look brown and delicious enough. I will be seeing a workplace tribunal, I think. We have got J-Boy is knackered with a $5. Left parties need to stop self-sabotaging by standing for policies only a minority of people believe in and instead focus on what the majority want. Nicholas Lovett with £2.22. Hated Sunak, but hate Keir Starmer more. I mean, look, you always hate the person that's in front of you. That's what I tell my husband whenever we're having a bad time. We've got Fez Gutra. I can't say that. Great discussion. Would love more of this format. Well, you're in luck. There's going to be another one with this exact collection of people tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. talking about Labour. We've got Joseph Ullman with £2. Keep up the good work. Thank you very much. We've got Nicholas Lovett again. Oh, thank you very much. You're never GB News, thankfully. And then we've got Scott 2 with Anglerland for the Angles. Probably not going to happen. The Angles don't, they're not really a polity anymore. And don't blame that on recent immigration. That happened a long time ago.
Can I just say as well, what about the Jutes and Saxons?
The Picts.
But what about the Picts?
You don't hear about the Picts.
Or the Brightons. Okay, so good luck.
Interesting fact.
Oh, yeah?
So none of us, however pale our skin, are remotely related to the people who built Stonehenge. Because 500 years after Stonehenge was built, that population was entirely replaced, either by genocide or disease.
Oh, look, I know that we're not genetically related to people that built Stonehenge because it was aliens, Michael.
True.
It was aliens. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Aaron. I love being able to talk to both of you at once about politics. I think it's like my favourite thing in the whole world.
And isn't it so nice being in the same room?
I know, it's so good. We've got big plans for Novara Live and to bring more IRL dimensions into it. And if you want to support that project, you know what to do. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Thank you very much for spending time with us. Good night.